Well, now it's our last lecture of the entire course, and I've enjoyed this course so much. But we're looking at this very strange symphony, this Ninth Symphony, perhaps Beethoven's most famous piece, but certainly his most confusing and complex. And we heard that first movement. I don't know what you made of it yet, but it's sort of chaotic and disjoint and ambiguous and intentionally so. And then the second movement, which is a scherzo and it's lively, but from a form point of view, quite surprising with the sonata form embedded in that scherzo. And now we come to the third movement, where he's now put the slow movement third instead of second. And this movement is really a very interesting movement. It's a theme and variations. So you know a theme and variations, you write a theme, or you can borrow someone else's. In this case, it's an original theme. And then you repeat the same length, the whole theme, but you change it. You might add notes or change the chords or flip it upside down, but you do the whole theme, and then you do that again and again. Each one's a variation of the theme. Just like the last movement of the Eroica Symphony, only not quite. So Beethoven begins with this introduction. It's not very long, and then the first theme, the main theme comes in, and it's not recognizable, it's not memorable. It's kind of like a hymn. In German, we call that a chorale. It's very abstract and Spartan, and it's really slow. And on the recording, you're going to hear it's really slow. Some people take it a little faster, but it's slow and it's long. I mean, the theme's more than a minute long, and it's this abstract. I want to say it's cold, but it's abstract. And when it's done, we'd expect to hear a variation of that theme, but instead he gives us a second theme. Second theme's a little faster, it's more warm, it's more human. Now, why these two themes? You know, in modern scholarship, no one will tell you. We don't know what Beethoven intended. Even when we have his conversation books, those books were edited by his biographer, and they're things out of context, and often they're what people said to him, not what he responded. You know, he was deaf, but he could speak. Um, we have some clues, but the tradition is that the first theme represents God, and the second theme represents humankind. Now, when I first heard that, I didn't believe it. I said, my teacher told me that in college. I'm not sure. You know, we were very much believers that music was music, and unless the composer wrote it on the score, don't believe it. But my conducting teacher, his sort of godfather, was this great conductor of the 1920s. I mean, we're talking 100 years ago. A very famous European conductor. And my teacher inherited his score collection. That's the music the conductors work from. And in the Beethoven Ninth, he had written some things. He'd written them in German. He was a Hungarian conductor, but he wrote in German. And I asked my teacher what they meant, and it said, theme of God, theme of man. So the Europeans have believed this from the beginning. In America, we're a little slower. I think it's probably right. This very strange movement opens with its abstraction, which is representing divinity in that we really can't grasp. And then we get humankind with the warmth and the love. And here's what's interesting. He brings back the theme of God for the variation. And in the variation, you can still hear it in its original form. It changes a little bit, but there's a sense of an unchanging nature of this piece. Then the human theme comes back, and it goes to a much bigger variation. And then the first theme comes back, or it doesn't. The two variations sort of meld, and soon we can't tell which theme we're listening to. Is it theme one or theme two? You know, we are created in God's image, and God is universal, and mankind is here on earth, but one reflects the other, and in fact, the divinity of the two of them blend until we can't separate them. To me, this is a profound statement that Beethoven's making, and if you don't understand the forms and so on, you can't possibly get it. But once we understand the forms, Beethoven's got something to say. Makes me think he's got something to say in the other two movements too. But we finish the third movement and we come to the fourth, the one that we're waiting for. It's got the Ode to Joy in it. It's got the famous tune in it. And it opens with one of the weirdest chords. I mean, in the 20th century, we've heard this chord. In the 21st century, but this is back in the beginning of the 19th century. And it's harsh. And I think one composer, I think it was Wagner, referred to it as the chord of terror. I mean, da, da, da. And after this explosive chord, the cellos and the basses, these are the low strings, play something that's marked quasi-recitative, or sort of as if a recitative. Now let's remember from our opera. Recitative is the part when you have lots of words and you're just trying to get the words out. So it's not very melodic, it's not very musical, but you got something to say. And so a singer might say something with words, and then the aria comes in afterwards. But why would you do a recitative when there are no words? Now, it turns out we will have words to some of this recitative later on. But what he wants is he wants the cellos and the basses to sound like they're human voices commenting, as if they're saying words. So he does this recitative-like passage, which is to tell you, this isn't just a tune, this is, I'm talking to you. So we hear this recitative, and then all of a sudden we hear the beginning of the first movement, that ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. That very strange music where we don't even know what key we're in, and the orchestra interrupts it. Bam, stop that. And then we hear the second movement, the scherzo, and the orchestra interrupts that, more recitative. Then we hear the beginning of the third movement, the theme of God. The orchestra still interrupts it, but this time very gently. I think that's intentional. And then we suddenly hear the Ode to Joy theme, still played in the cellos, and he plays it 2 or 3 times like variations. He adds a bassoon part, he adds the trumpets. It was quite heroic. But we hear that melody. We don't really know what it means, except it's a great tune. And Beethoven did write a lot of great tunes, so it's very noticeable, this great tune. And then suddenly the chord of terror comes back. What? Yes, the chord of terror. And now, instead of the cellos doing a recitative, the actual singer. This is a bass. So we have 4 soloists. Highest voice is soprano, then the alto, the next voice, then the tenor, and then the bass or baritone. So those are our voices. And this low voice sings in German, but the translation is basically, friends, no longer these sounds. Let us rather sing happier thoughts of joy. And so that's how we transition. So that's telling you these early thoughts. Now, what are the early thoughts? It's got to be the first movement, second movement, and third movement, right? It's got to be. So the first movement has to represent something that he's rejecting. The second movement, for all its joy, he's rejecting. The third, which he's very tender about, this religious vision, he's even saying, let's put that aside. Not that we're going to reject it, but let's think about something else, maybe still divine, but maybe a little more specific. So he says that, and then the choir comes in and sings the first part of the Ode to Joy. Joy for a beautiful spark of God, daughter of the Elysian fields, of Elysium. And the bass sings it, and the chorus sings it, and we're off and running. But the piece is not done yet. I mean, it's going to go on for a while as we do different verses. But now there's a couple interesting things. One is that he changes the order of the verses. He doesn't use them all, and he doesn't immediately do the chorus after the verse. He does another verse. He does the chorus. He messes up the order. He's rewriting the poem for his purposes. So one thing we want to do is compare the old version and Beethoven's new version. See what Beethoven's emphasizing, what he really wants to tell us. Even then, we need a little more knowledge. So the opening is quite straight ahead, but we finally come to a verse that in German is Seid umschlungen Millionen, be embraced, ye millions. This kiss is for the entire world. On your knees, don't you know the Creator lives? He must live above the starry canopy. That's that great bit of text. The verb tense is not let's be embraced, it's be embraced. That command form is a form we see in the Bible all the time. And when Schiller wrote that, he was probably trying to make it seem scriptural, biblical, so give it the power of real sacredness. So Beethoven does something very interesting in the setting. Now I'm going to do a little regression for you. We have a text that we say, the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised. The trouble is, when that phrase was written, there was nothing called a trumpet. The modern trumpet, 1700 we had trumpets, 1650 we had trumpets, and we added the valves to them about 1850. But before that, there wasn't really something called a trumpet. And in fact, I don't know the ancient text, but the Latin text is tuba mirum. The tuba shall sound. But the tuba is an even more recent invention. That's 1800, 1810. There was tubas. Beethoven did not write really for tuba. It didn't exist yet. So what does he mean? The trumpet shall sound, or tuba mirum? Well, we've always thought it means trumpet or some brass instrument like a trumpet. The Germans think it means a bass trumpet. And in fact, the bass trumpet that they use is the trombone. The only difference between a trombone and a trumpet, besides the fact that a trombone's lower, is that modern trumpets use valves. Trombone uses a slide to change notes. But they're built exactly the same. They're really the same instrument. So in Germany, they don't say the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised. They say the trombone shall sound and the dead shall be raised. It's just as good a translation. And so up until this time, until Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the trombone was never used in concert music. It was considered a sacred instrument. You would use it in the church. You'd use it with masses, and occasionally in the opera, if there was something sacred in the opera, you would use the trombone to tell the audience this is something sacred. So it did appear in the opera, but never on stage. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, when he wants us to know he's writing about the resurrection, he uses trombone. The Sixth Symphony the same way. They didn't use it in the Seventh and Eighth. So now the trombones have been sitting on that stage for that whole first movement, the second movement, third movement. 40 minutes later, they still haven't played, and suddenly, Bom Zeitum Schlung, and suddenly the trombones come out with the cellos and basses with that verb tense, and Beethoven's telling you, this is the word of God. Be embraced, this kiss. But now it's really interesting too, because just like in the theme and variations, it starts very abstractly. It's just the trombone, the cellos, the basses, low instruments, and the male voices. No real melody, no warmth, no sweetness, but powerful. And then after the first line, the violins come in, the women's voices come in, and it becomes much lusher and more romantic and more human. Same with the second line. He keeps doing it. It's as if God has these commandments for us, but we have to take the word and translate it into human kind of voice. The universe is big and cold, and these universal words come down, and we have to imbue them with humanity. And so there's a lot of message in this. Now, as you hear this movement, again, I'm hoping you enjoy it. The things to think about. What did that first movement really mean, and why is he rejecting it? Two, the second movement is really very pleasant. Why would he reject that? The third movement, is it really about God and man? And if it is, it's profound. Why would he reject it? Although it doesn't surprise us he does it gently. Maybe it's not a rejection. Maybe it's we'll think about that later. Why does he change the order of the text? Why is that particular text sacred? Why does it build the way it does? And you'll also see that there's no form in this movement. He puts transitions that are really developments and things. We have no name for this form. So now has he given up all his Enlightenment thought, and this is pure romantic thought? But then why is it all about democracy and religion, which are things you don't expect in the Romantic era? You expect it to be centered on yourself and this sort of deist idea of non-intervention God. And so what's Beethoven? Where does he fit? Where does he compare to Goethe? Which of these lines of thought are going to take us to the democracies that became France, England, and current Germany, and which of these thoughts would take us instead to the dictatorships that was Mussolini's fascism and Nazism and Stalin's communism? They're very close together, Beethoven and Goethe. Which of these ideas take us where? And then when you think about this, now you understand the power of the old arts, and you have as much understanding as anyone else. You can now look at art and see the world, which will be, of course, your final paper, to look at some piece of art and see the world around it. Thank you, guys. It's been a great class. Love having you. Can't wait to read your papers. Enjoy this profound symphony.